Well, a very good evening to everyone who is joining us for this Kohima Educational Trust webinar tonight on the story of Captain John Young at Kharasom way back in March 1944. We're just going to wait a little while until everyone logs on from wherever they're joining us. But wherever you're joining us from, you're very, very welcome. And we've had an extraordinary variety of geographies from where people have come from our previous webinars, from Hong Kong and Nagaland, of course, and Australia and Canada and the UK as well. So we're delighted that you're all joining us. We'll just give people a few more moments to make sure they're logged in and their Zoom is working and their volume's loud and clear. And once everyone's in, then we'll formally start with Sylvia, who's the Chief Executive of the Kohima Educational Trust. And it's really exciting for us all to be able to do this and discover a new and a powerful way to be able to tell the story of Nagaland during the Second World War, and particularly the crucial battles of Kohima, and also the work of the Kohima Educational Trust in perpetuating the legacy of the men who fought there, who wanted the relationship between the British and the Indians and the Naga people to be remembered in the KET. So that's why we're here tonight, and we hope that you're going to enjoy it and get a lot out of it. We're certainly delighted to be here and presenting. Sylvia.
Well, good evening, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all again and to introduce this event, the third webinar hosted by the Kohima Educational Trust. The story of Jock Young started for me with a "how was your day?" question to my 91-year-old dad back in March 2011, when he told me that he had been to Glasgow in the rain without a coat. Having been born in Glasgow, you'd think he might have expected some inclemency in the weather. He'd been invited by Roy McCallum to participate in the event of the unveiling of a plaque dedicated to Lieutenant John Young in a Glasgow street where John had lived. It was the final chapter in a long story begun by Roy, which we will hear about this evening. Before meeting Roy, Dad had not known of these actions of a fellow Scot, but had been captivated by his story, and for the next few weeks he infused in me an interest in Lieutenant Young's self-sacrificing bravery. So much so that when my husband and I were in Nagaland a year later with a filmmaker, we felt we must visit Jessamy to see the memorial stone and to include his story in our film, Kohima, an exploration of war, memory and gratitude. Our last webinar was about valour in Kohima, where the conversation focused on the 2 VCs that were awarded to 2 very brave men. Jock Young was also a brave man, as many of that generation were, when asked to do their duty. We knew, therefore, that we wanted to give this particular story its own airtime. I will now hand over to Dr Robert Lyman and Roy McCallum for the talk this evening about the battles of Kharasom, Jessamy, and the story of Jock Young. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you very much indeed, Sylvia, and again, a very warm welcome to everyone tonight. Well, I suppose like most conversations of this kind, we need to start with focusing on Kohima and where it was and why it was so important. Kohima, of course, is the administrative capital of the Naga Hills at the time in 1944. It was the gateway to India. It held the road to Imphal, the very critical line of communication that ran between Dimapur and the Brahmaputra Valley. Indeed, it still does, and Imphal, the capital of Manipur, which abuts Burma. Kohima itself was an administrative post on the way to Imphal. It wasn't designed for defense. It was significant for lots of reasons, but it wasn't ever thought prior to the end of 1943 that it would be a location of a significant military confrontation between the Commonwealth and Japan. But precisely because it occupied such a strategic geography, it was the focus for the Japanese invasion of India, or a significant focus for the Japanese invasion of India in March 1944. And when the Japanese invaded India and attacked into Kohima, the first 2 weeks of their offensive around Kohima constituted the siege of the Kohima Ridge, shown here, with the modern-day Commonwealth Wargrave Cemetery on Garrison Hill occupying the site of the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow and his tennis court. Between the 4th and the 20th of April, 1,500 soldiers of the 4th, 7th Punjab and the 4th Battalion of the Royal West Kent, among several others, held off General Sato's division of probably by that time 14 to 15,000 men. Kohima and the location of this battle and the site that you can see on the screen was the Indian Army's Thermopylae, across the saddle of hills that offered entry to the Brahmaputra Valley and the riches of India beyond. Now these were, and still are, the Naga Hills. They were called the Naga Hills at the time, or what in 1967 became the Indian state of Nagaland. The people here were and are Angami Nagas. The photograph you can see is from 1937. They're not Angami Nagas, they're from Noklak. The Angami Nagas were probably one of 17 Naga tribes who inhabit these beautiful hills. At the time, the hills weren't formally part of the British Empire. It's quite a complex story. But from the late 19th and early 20th century, if Naga villagers asked for protection for themselves from their headhunting neighbours, the British Commissioner for the Hill Tribes in Delhi would usually oblige and allow the local Deputy Commissioner, who at the time of the invasion by the Japanese in 1944 was a man called Charles Pawsey, to expand his territorial remit for the supervision of administration and order. For a very small tax to pay for security in the form of the Assam Rifles, a local militia, villagers received British protection and were enabled to live peaceably among their neighbours. It was in this way that the Raj slowly crept into the hills in the years after the Angami Nagas at Kohima were subdued by military force in 1879. Military subjugation was accompanied by a significant missionary effort by mainly American missionaries. And the result was that the Nagas, particularly along this main route into Manipur, were by the First World War predominantly Christian and generally supportive of British rule. Now, I need to introduce you now to the Assam Regiment. And the Assam Regiment was the newest regiment in the Indian Army, being raised in 1941, just before the Japanese entered the war that September with their invasion of Malaya and their bombing of Rangoon, and of course, the infamous attack at the same time on Pearl Harbor. Now, this regiment comprised 2 battalions of locally raised Assamese troops and non-commissioned officers and some junior officers by 1944, with mainly British senior officers in 2 battalions. Many of these soldiers were Nagas, others were from other tribes in Assam, such as Khazis, Assamese, and Kukis. And their primary task of the Assam Regiment was the defense of Assam. And in the years before 1944, they were located at Dubois and Lido, supporting and protecting the American Hump airlift effort. But taking the story a little bit further on, in December 1943, the British began receiving reports that the Japanese were preparing to invade India. And in March 1944, this attack came, the so-called March on Delhi, led by the man who had captured Singapore, General Mutaguchi Renya. The plan was that about 20,000 men in Sato's division were to march across the Naga Hills to take Kohima and to prevent the British from sending troops back through the hills from Dimapur to reinforce the town of Imphal. The objective of General Sato's 31st Division, therefore, was Kohima. What I need to do now is very briefly describe to you some of the key locations in the defense of the Naga Hills. And we can see on the slide here the river Chindwin, denoting effectively the border between Burma on the right and India, and the Naga Hills on the left-hand side. And one of the predominant characteristics of the topography that you can see are the hills that run between the Chindwin River in the east and the Brahmaputra River in the west, slightly out of our picture on the screen. Dimapur on the left is a very significant administrative base by 1944. It was the point through which the Americans were supplied northern Lido, and it was the administrative base through which supplies were sent across the mountains into Imphal. And on that route, of course, on that road was Kohima, marked by the star. Now, further to the east of Kohima, marked a number of posts in Naga villages predominantly, where British troops of the 14th Army watched and waited for signs of enemy activity. That these primary posts were at Fort Carey, Jessamy, Kharasom, Ukral, and Sangshak. And a little note about the forces that were deployed in these areas. Let's just start with our 20,000 men of Sato's 31st Division. For those of you who are au fait with these matters, a Japanese division was effectively the size of a British corps. He had 3 regiments, the 58th, the 138th, and the 124th Regiment. In the Naga Hills at Fort Carey, we had a V-Force patrol, a very small patrol of soldiers overlooking the Chindwin. These soldiers carried out operations across the Chindwin, in fact, to gain intelligence as to what the Japanese were up to. Further back at Jessamy, by the time the Japanese invaded, were 2 companies, slightly more than 2 companies of the 1st Battalion, the Assam Regiment, under the command of Colonel Bruno Brown, the commanding officer of the regiment. And then 45 miles south of Jessamy at Kharasom, the subject of tonight's conversation, the first, one company, there's a company of the 1st Battalion, the Assam Regiment, commanded by Captain John Young. And there's a little bit of, in case anyone's confused about the terminology, he was a substantive lieutenant in the British Army, but was an acting captain. Further south of Ukral were 2 battalions of the 50th Indian Parachute Brigade at Sangshak, very weak battalions, not there for any defensive purposes, but anticipating a rest prior to deployment in support of the 23rd Indian Division, part of 4 Corps south at Imphal. And then back at Kohima. Kohima, as I suggested at the start, wasn't designed or prepared for defense. We had troops of 161 Brigade, part of the 7th Indian Division, which had previously fought in Arakan, comprising the 1st Punjab, 4th, 7th Rajputs, and the 4th Battalion Royal West Kents. And in addition to that, a considerable number, probably 1,000 men or so, of administrative soldiers carrying out administrative and support functions around the garrison. And the garrison commander was a man called Colonel Hugh Richards, who had been allocated to the Gurkhas, but because he was an old man, according to Ward Wingate, he was over 40 years old, he was taken out of his Chindit command and given responsibility for Kohima. And it was a good thing for Kohima that he was. Back in Dimapur, there was nothing. And this was a primary concern. We don't have time to discuss that tonight, but a primary concern for General Slim and General Stopford of 33 Corps about exactly where British defences should focus. Should they be focused on Dimapur or Kohima? That's a story for another time. And the Japanese assault routes, the Sasato's routes, there were 3 columns. I've just reduced them to 2 red arrows here, from Homelin on the Chindwin to Ukral. In fact, there were 2 columns going towards Ukral. 1 column after Ukral was going to carry straight on to Malsansong on the road to Imphal, and the other column was going to go from Ukral northeast back along a ridge to Kharasam. And the northern column would go from Mungkang directly to Fort Carey, where it would divide. One part would go to Kharasam and the other part would go north to Jessamy. And all columns would then converge on Kohima. General Mutaguchi had instructed his entire army, nearly 100,000 men, in fact, slightly more than that, to overcome their objectives in 3 weeks. And certainly he expected General Sato to have occupied Kohima within 2 to 3 weeks. Well, we're going to leap forward now and just talk very quickly about what happened when Sato moved through these hills after engagement at the points on the compass that I've described at Sangshak and Kharasom and Jessamy. The first element of the Japanese 31st Division arrived at Kohima Ridge on the 4th of April, and over the next week built up their forces and applied all the effort they could to overcome the defenses that Colonel Hugh Richards had built up around the Kohima Ridge, that picture I showed you at the start, where the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery currently is. And for those 2 weeks, the 4th to the 20th of April, Sato vented his entire fury on the ridge, trying to break through, fighting against the 1,500 men of the Assam Regiment, the 4th Battalion of the Royal West Kent, the 4th 7th Punjab Company, the 4th 7th Punjab, and a number of other small units. And during that time, the story of the siege was that the Commonwealth forces, the forces of 14th Army, withstood the forces of Sato. Sato by that time probably had 14 to 15,000 men massing around Kohima. Sato failed to break through. Well, one of the reasons why he failed to break through was the bravery and courage and determination of the defenders on Kohima Ridge. And the battle was an extraordinary example of fortitude and valor. But there was another reason for Sato not breaking through. And a primary reason, in my view, were the three precursor battles that took place before Sato's troops even arrived in Kohima at Sangshak, Kharasom, and Jessamy. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about Kharasom and Jessamy. Well, as we've seen, most of the Assam Regiment had been sent forward, slightly more than 3 companies of the battalion of 500 men had been sent to Kharasom and Jessamy as an early warning shield when it was clear that the Japanese were going to advance into the Naga Hills. This is early March 1944. The young company commander at Kharasom was Captain John Young. John was born in Glasgow in August 1919, and he attended Hillhead High School before leaving school to become a bank clerk. And like so many young men of his generation, he realized that war was inevitable and worried about the threat of Nazism in Europe. He joined in May 1939 the Glasgow Highlanders. Young actually proved to be a natural soldier. Within weeks of joining, he was promoted to Lance Corporal, and by the end of 1939, by which time war, of course, had been declared, he had been promoted again to corporal. Before the end of 1940, John Young had reached the rank of sergeant, and he'd become an instructor, something I've always chuckled at. In order to become an instructor in the Glasgow Highlanders, he must have been very good. He was clearly a natural leader, and in March 1941, he was commissioned into the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. He then completed officer training, and in 1942 was put in charge of a draft of men aboard a troop ship bound for India. And when he arrived in Bombay in July, he was sent to Shillong in Assam, the capital of Assam, on secondment to the newly raised Assam Regiment. And he remained with the Assam Regiment from then on. Until the end of 1943, there was no indication, however, the Japanese had any plans to invade India. So to all intents and purposes, I suspect that John Young thought that he was in a bit of a cushy posting and would be able to serve out the war without having seen a shot fired in anger. All that, of course, changed at the end of 1943, and in early 1944, preparations were made to receive a Japanese attack. But it wasn't expected. This attack wasn't expected to be anything near as substantial as it turned out to be. General Slim, who through Ultra knew that a Japanese attack was coming, thought that at the most the Japanese would deploy the equivalent of a brigade of troops, perhaps 3,000 men, on Kohima. And as we already know, the Japanese attack turned out to be considerably larger. Now, in the first instance, the role of the 1st Battalion of the Assam Regiment, the 2nd Battalion was back in Shillong, was to protect the villages that ran east from Kohima. The Burmese border, shown by the Chinwan, was about 120 miles to the east. And the battalion's life was taken up with patrolling the paths up to the Chinwan, trying to work out what, if anything, the Japanese were doing. Then, when news of significant Japanese activity in the far bank of the Chinwin arrived, the battalion and its 500 soldiers were tasked with the defense of the villages of Jessamy and Kharasom, two prominent Naga villages sitting astride major tracks that made their way west towards Kohima. Jessamy was 45 miles east of Kohima and Kharasom south of Jessamy. That was a 75-mile journey from Kohima, cutting across the hills to Kharasom. Thus, the battalion found itself on its own at the northern tip of the British defence plan in what had been considered to be a quiet location, as British Staff Appreciations, as I've indicated, had ruled out any possibility of the advance of any more than a Japanese regiment or a brigade through the remote and rugged hills. The commanding officer, who I've mentioned, was Colonel Bruno Brown, sent the 100 men of A Company, commanded by John Young, down to Kharasom and ordered him and the company to build defensive positions covering the roads going south to Ukral and east to the Chinwin, while the remainder of the battalion dug in at Jessamy. Well, at Kharasom, John Young stocked ammunition, water and food, while the Naga inhabitants, aware that something was up, made arrangements to hide their livestock and possessions in the hills outside of the village. Soldiers patrolled into the hills to the east and down into Burma itself, discovering lots of recent activity by the Japanese. Young's precise orders were to stop or delay the Japanese advance. In fact, in one order, he was instructed to fight to the last man and to the last bullet. On the 26th of March 1944, one of Young's patrols returned with the news that what looked like to be about 1,000 enemy soldiers, so about a battalion or more, were coming along the track that led to the south. That's the south, that's down to Ukral. At 6 o'clock the following morning, Young radioed Jessamy to report that at least a battalion of Japanese infantry with pack mules and elephants carrying and pulling artillery and mortars were approaching his position. That was the last time that anybody outside Kharasom spoke to John Young. Now, these Japanese troops appeared not to know that Kharasom was garrisoned by the Assam Regiment. When the enemy column marched along the road immediately below A Company's position, Young ordered his troops to open fire. The Japanese, taken entirely by surprise, suffered very heavy casualties as a consequence. They then made a series of immediate attacks on A Company's trenches and bunkers, but made no headway. Casualties were immediately occurred, the Japanese countering time and again that morning with frontal attacks and mortar fire. At noon, the Japanese pulled back, this is the 27th of March, but attacked again at dusk, but failed again to penetrate the defensive perimeter of Young's position. And this pattern was repeated overnight and for the next 3 days, with the Japanese making repeated frontal attacks, but always being repulsed by the young Assamese soldiers in Young's company. To vent their anger, the Japanese burnt down Kharasom village, the Naga inhabitants looking on with what must have been anger and despair from the surrounding jungle. Then, on the 31st of March, a new column of Japanese troops, again with mules and elephants, was seen approaching again from the south, from the direction of Ukral. And what John Young didn't know was that these were troops who had been released from a very significant battle at Sangshak against the 50th Indian Parachute Brigade that had delayed the troops for 3 or 4 days and had caused them significant casualties. But Young knew, with the news of this new column, that his men were now too exhausted to effectively resist these fresh troops, and his water supply was almost finished, as was his ammunition. He had lost contact with his commanding officer, Colonel Bruno Brown, in Jessamy early in the battle, when mortar fire had killed his second in command and destroyed his radio link. And he was unaware that the order to fight to the last man in the last round had been rescinded. He knew also that the Japanese were working around and beyond his position. He knew that to sacrifice his remaining men would serve no good purpose. So he called his Assamese platoon commanders and his senior non-commissioned officers together. After thanking them for their bravery and their unwavering commitment, he ordered them to escape back through the hills to Kohima. He would remain. He told them that his orders were to fight to the last man and the last bullet. He had decided that he would be the last man. He would fire the last bullet. Despite their desperate objections, Captain Young insisted, and that night his men melted away in the darkness. Young remained at his post. The last time his men saw him, he was stacking ammunition and hand grenades around his trench, preparing for the next Japanese attack. The following morning, Naga villagers reported hearing heavy firing from the area of his trench, followed by the crump of hand grenades and then silence. Most of Young's men made it back to Kohima and took part in the following battle and the eventual defeat of the Japanese. No one saw Young die, except of course the Japanese, who honored the remarkable heroism of this man with a warrior's burial. The villagers of Kharasam later told Sir Charles Palsy, the deputy commissioner in Nagaland, that the Japanese were so impressed with his conduct that they shaved the head of his corpse and buried him with full military honors in the style of a Japanese samurai. Palsy commented, "There is no question that their stand in the last days of March gave time for something to be got ready at Kohima. They saved Kohima and India." And here was Colonel Hugh Richards' comments. Remember, the garrison commander of Kohima, whose efforts were largely responsible for arranging the defense of Kohima so successfully and keeping Sato at bay. These are his comments when he heard of Young's death. "The action of the company of the Assam Regiment at Kharasam," he wrote, "is a wonderful and a tragic story. The company commander, Captain Young, after 4 days of fighting, realizing that in view of the strength of the enemy, there could only be one end, namely annihilation of his company, decided to send those who were left back to Kohima. But because of his orders were to hold to the last man and last round, he remained behind him and was last seen killing off mules and surrounding himself with bombs. It is sad that such a gallant officer should have been lost in this way and by such a great act of self-sacrifice." Well, I'm sure you will agree that John Young's sacrifice was remarkable and played a significant part in the wider story of the battle. What would have happened if he and his loyal Assamese soldiers had not fought so ferociously at Kharasam and held up General Sato's advance for as long as they did? It's more than possible that the entire story of the battle would have been very different. What is certain is that John Young knew nothing of the implications or otherwise of attending to his duty. He accepted the task that he had been given and willingly sacrificed himself for the lives of his men in an act that, in my view, was to decisively benefit the British and Indian soldiers defending India from attack at Kohima. But he has received no recognition of any kind for any act of gallantry and devotion, of duty, rarely surpassed in the annals of British military history. His sacrifice went unknown in the country for whom he died, except to his native soldiers who talked of him as the embodiment of the empire they so respected and honored. On the memorial at the entrance to the famous cemetery at Kohima, where he lies buried, the inscription on the 2nd Division memorial reads, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today." I've often pondered the nature of John Young's sacrifice when he committed to defending that trench on his own after sending his men to safety. He knew what the end would be. He wasn't there to surrender, but to die. He knew the consequences of his decision, or so he thought. He thought the consequence would be that he would be killed and by so doing would be known as a man who knew his duty and who did it. But he could never know the bigger picture that his obedience to his orders meant, far beyond his own life and the situation in that lonely mountain town of Kharasam. His sacrifice meant liberty for many others. At the very least, it meant delay for Sato's legions as they pressed on towards Kohima, and it undoubtedly gave the frantically preparing defenders of that town, outnumbered 10-1, precious time to complete their preparations. We know now that when Sato launched his attacks on Kohima, he did so piecemeal, taking several days to gather his strength together. That this was so was due in part to John Young and his young Assamese and the young Assamese soldiers of A Company, 1st Battalion, the Assam Regiment. This was something of which Young was never to know, that his bravery and his selfless sacrifice had such extraordinary consequences. Well, that's the story of John Young at Kharasom. I'm now going to hand over to my good friend Roy McCallum, who will take up the story of how he discovered the story of this remarkable man and played a significant role in bringing it back to public remembrance. Over to you, Roy.
Thanks, Rob. And even though I know the story pretty thoroughly, I found that absolutely fascinating. Thanks very much indeed, and good evening to everyone. I wouldn't want people to think that I've got nothing better to do with my time than to prowl around history and stick my nose into other people's business, because that's not what happened here. This actually started because my dad was just about the quietest man that you could imagine. He had served throughout World War II, but you could not get him to talk about it. It wasn't any false modesty. He was just a very quiet, shy man who didn't like the sound of his own voice. And way back about 23 years ago, I eventually persuaded him to sit down, and I provided him with a block of lined writing paper, pencils, pens, Tipp-Ex, and all the paraphernalia needed, and to write down for me his entire army service. It took him almost a year, but he thoroughly enjoyed doing it and was surprisingly open about some of the things. So it ended up in the form of a book. That's it there. I called it One of a Number, and I gave it his name and his army number at the bottom. I didn't bother having his handwritten notes transcribed. I just had it professionally bound as a handwritten book. It's a unique piece of work. That was him there, John McCallum. And I've read that book more times than I can remember. But the very first time I read it, one thing that struck me was that for private soldiers of my father's generation, it really was a case of theirs not to reason why. He rarely knew where he was going or why he was going there. He rarely knew what he was to do when he got there, and he almost never knew what the big picture was. And he freely admitted this when I discussed it with him after I'd got the book. And I then set about trying to fill in all the blanks. Now, I had known my dad's, it'll take a couple of minutes to explain this, I'd known and outlined his service, but not the detail. But one thing that became clear right away was that my dad was one of a relatively small number of British soldiers who saw active service against all 4 of his country's enemies. Now, Rob knows I quite enjoy saying that, because I know when I say it, people are taking off their fingers saying, the Germans, the Japanese, the Italians, who else had we fallen out with? My dad was in active service against the Vichy French in the summer of 1941, and he was then under siege in Tobruk in 1941, and then his division sailed for India, and then eventually he was in the Chindits, and he was in one of the first gliders to land in Operation Thursday when they landed at Broadway, early March 1944, just as John Young and his friends were preparing the defence at Kharasom. Now, I started, and it took a long, long time to find things out from my dad, because he had lots and lots of blanks that he didn't know about. For example, the troop ship that he sailed in from the Clyde in 1941 had no one aboard was told why, but it suddenly stopped and put back into Liverpool and was there for 2 weeks. I was able to tell him the troop ship, the Reina del Pacifico, in fact had struck an underwater object, possibly a submarine, in the Bristol Channel, and had lost a propeller. And that's why they went back in. But none of the troops aboard were told this, but I was able to tell them that whole 20 years ago, and filled in lots and lots of other blanks. Now, you know how the internet works. You prowl around it, you put in names and you put in dates and things of that kind. And over the years, I was finding out more and more for him. And I found an extract of a book on the internet written by someone who had almost certainly been in the same glider as my dad, going in behind Japanese lines. And that started me searching around that particular period of March 1944. And my dad's name was John McCallum, and his army pals called him Mac, some of course called him Jock. And it was while prowling around John McCallum, that I stumbled on John McCulloch Young. That's just the way the internet works. And I read this amazing account, exactly as you just outlined, of the Battle of Kharasom, in this extraordinary act of courage. What I didn't know at the time was I was reading an extract from a book called Springboard to Victory by Brigadier C.E. Lucas Phillips way back in the 60s. And someone had taken this extract out and had posted it on a website somewhere, I can't recall where it was exactly. And I read this with incredulity. And then at the end of it, whoever had posted this up, he said on it that it was unfair that all that Jock Young got was a posthumous MC. Now, that caught my attention because, of course, the MC wasn't available posthumously in World War II. In fact, it's only recently become available posthumously. Way back at that time, the only medal you could get posthumously was the Victoria Cross. If you didn't get the VC, you get a mention in dispatches and nothing else. So I assumed that John Young had been awarded the MC for an action prior to Kharasam, and the chap had simply made a mistake. So I looked up, the first thing I found was his grave marker, a photograph of his grave marker, taken by, of all people, Rob Lyman. And I knew of Rob Lyman as an author, but I didn't know anything else about him at the time. But the grave marker made no mention of a decoration, and that was unlikely to be a mistake. I then found his entry in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and there was no mention of an MC or a mention in dispatches. And considering what he had done, that absolutely astonished me. I mean, how anyone could have done that and get nothing for it amazed me, and frankly still amazes me. Even all these years later, it still amazes me. For about the next 2 years, I researched the story, and it took me into all kinds of places. I got to know very well Rob Lyman, I got to know very well Gordon Graham, I got to know reasonably well Fergal Keane, lots of other people, and they were all, without exception, extremely generous with their help and their advice and their research and their knowledge. I got in touch with a librarian at the Sandhurst Military Academy. I was in touch with the curator of records at the Asian Studies in Cambridge University, and a whole host of things like that. And every bit of information that came back confirmed that what I'd read about John Young was no exaggeration. He had done exactly as had been described. There was a later book published, Not Ordinary Men, which described exactly the same action. And I just could not understand why nothing had been done about this. It just seemed a dreadful injustice. And believe me, it was nothing to do with the fact he was a Scotsman. I would have felt exactly the same way had been a Cockney. I just thought this was an absolutely appalling business. I started then to build up quite a file. In fact, ended up at 2 inches thick, a file of information that would prove the case that this man should be recognised. And if you try to find the department in the Military of Defence that looks into this, believe me, you'll struggle, because they are very, very elusive. And it was only through the wife of a friend who happened to have been a civil servant in the MOD that I discovered that you have to contact Ministry of Defence, Military Secretary Honours, Level 8, Zone J, Main Building, Whitehall, London, SW7A 2HP. Doesn't exactly trip off the tongue. So I put together the file. I sent a 3-page letter. I had everything in it. Copies of letters from a fellow officer in the Assam Regiment to his parents, copies of a diary, various extracts from the history of the Assam Regiment by Peter Stein, which, by the way, was an extremely difficult book to get hold of. I think you've got a copy, Rob, haven't you?
Yes.
You're very lucky. I found that very difficult. I found a copy in a university in America, and the librarian was kind enough to take pictures of photocopies and send them to me, and I sent him a bottle of Dalwhinnie, and I hope he thought it was a reasonable exchange. But the whole thing came together into, I thought, a very, very impressive file of evidence, and I sent it off to that department in the Ministry of Defence. And about 2 weeks later, I received a letter in reply from a Colonel Stewart, retired Colonel Stewart. And it was an extremely gracious letter. I mean, he clearly sympathised. He didn't for a moment dispute any of the evidence that was put up. But he told me something that really surprised me, that in 1948, just 1948, just after the war ended, a decision was taken in government circles that no further awards were made for World War II. Irrespective of the evidence, no further awards were made. And he told me, and I've since discovered he was quite right, that that had never been breached. That decision had never been, there was no exceptions to that at all. No awards were made since 1948. So that really was the end of the matter as far as they were concerned. While I had been researching it, the people in Hillhead High School, which John Young had attended, as you know, had been very, very helpful. And someone there told me that John Young's family had worshipped in the Wellington Church, which is a very big, well-known Church of Scotland in the West End of Glasgow. And in fact, when I visited the church to have a look, I discovered that his name in their war memorial, in fact, is Jack Young. So I suspect the family must have called him Jack. But a lady in the church suggested to me that I contact a Glasgow councillor, a chap called McKechnie, James McKechnie, that she thought would help. And that was quite an inspired suggestion. Jim McKechnie, in fact, was an absolute gem of a man. He really was first class. He got his teeth into this very early on. Unfortunately for us, he was very friendly with the Lord Provost of Glasgow. Now, you probably all know the Lord Provost is our equivalent of the Lord Mayor. He's the chap in Glasgow with the gold chain round his neck, etc. He was very friendly with the Lord Provost of Glasgow and Mr. Winter. And there again, we were fortunate because Mr. Winter was an ex-serviceman and he was instantly sympathetic. And he just decided without any discussion that one of these blue plaques would go up at 7 Jedburgh Gardens, where John Young's family had lived and where he was brought up, which was fine. The trouble is that when John Young lived there, these were all rented apartments, as most of Glasgow was at that time. But by this time, this came along, they were all privately owned. So they had to write to 8 different owners of the flats up this common close, 7 of whom very enthusiastically said yes, they would give her permission, and 1 of whom very emphatically said no, that they thought this sort of thing was a glorification of war and they would have no part on it and no part of it, and that no such plaque would go up in the building. So that was the end of that. The provost decided that something would be done, so he then decreed that a pavement plaque would be put outside. A bronze plaque would be put outside 7 Jedburgh Gardens, and nobody could object to that, because that, of course, was within the power of the city council. The only problem with that was that Mr. Alistair MacDonald, the head of planning in Glasgow, pointed out that it wouldn't last more than 3 weeks because metal theft was so common that bronze was a very, very attractive thing for thieves. And all over the place, bronze was being dug up and stolen. In fact, a huge memorial to a mining disaster not far outside Glasgow was something weighing tons was stolen and never seen again. So that put the tin hat on that one. So that's when they came up with the granite plaque, which the City of Glasgow paid for. I was asked to write it, which I did. And that's it, you see it there. And it was put in place and was unveiled in 2011. And that was when Gordon Graham and Rob and a colonel from the Indian Army came up. And Gordon and his wife Betty actually got a ride in the Lord Provost's car, which is more than most people get, I have to tell you. And it was altogether very, very nice day. I found that whole thing very, very satisfying. That was then later followed by a decision from the whole piping circle, the Piping Times, which I think is the main newspaper of people who play the bagpipes all over the world. They decided they wanted to do something about this. In fact, they're located not too far from Jedburgh Gardens, and they decided to hold an international competition for a pipe tune. And it was won by a pipe major, a retired pipe major, Peter McInnes. And it was played, in fact, it was played, the tune was played by an army piper. I can't recall the exact date that took place, but it was a very, very moving affair, and it was just something that just finally put the polish on the fact that John Young was remembered. the plaque was very satisfactory. I was delighted with that, but I was equally delighted with the coverage that it got. BBC TV covered it, STV covered it, all the Scottish newspapers covered it, and the whole thing spread. And in fact, I've come across various forum, people discussing military matters where the story is told and told again. So John Young didn't get what he deserved, and I still don't know why that was. Just as a matter of interest, Fergal Keane had a theory that his CEO, Colonel Brown, didn't approve of what he'd done. Now, whether that's true or not, of course, we'll never know. But that was Fergal Keane's theory, that he and Colonel Brown didn't get on too well, and that Colonel Brown didn't write him up for anything. I wonder, in one of the letters that Lloyd Jones wrote home in July, it seemed clear they didn't at that stage have any idea what happened to John Young. So maybe it's been as simple as that. They just didn't know what happened. And of course, Colonel Brown was later killed in the campaign. But the amount of publicity it generated about John Young and the number of folk who heard and read his story, I found that really quite delightful, and I thought, well, and then later on to discover, of course, he had family down south, and then we met them, and the fact that they knew this had happened was extremely satisfactory. But the only feeling I have about it now is a tremendous gratitude to a whole host of people who heard the story and were only too willing to help. People, some of them all over the world, more than willing to help. And if he didn't get what he deserved then, he got a little bit of what he deserved later.
Roy, it's time to listen to the pipe tune. Thank you very much indeed, Roy. We'll now ask Sylvia May to tell us something of her journey to Jessamy a few years ago.
Well, as I said in my introduction, my interest in Jock Young started vicariously on a wet Glasgow street and culminated in this remote village of Jessamy, which you can see there in the centre of the screen. My father, Gordon Graham, the founding inspiration behind KET, had decided that we should make a film. Thus, in 2012, my husband and I went to Kohima accompanied by a filmmaker, David Percy, and his wife, and we embarked on a trip around Nagaland to interview Naga veterans and to film various KET and KES projects. We'd been to PAC, where KET had facilitated a wish from a veteran to build a basketball court. This is a long story and will be part of a future webinar. On the way back to Kohima, we persuaded our wonderful Naga team to go via Jessamy, much harder to reach than some villages, but they were kind enough to take us there over the border into Manipur. Despite having given the locals there little notice, we were warmly welcomed, and the village elders laid on a reception committee for us. We were guided around the village by two veterans of the battle who took us to vantage points, showing us where the Assam Regiment had fallen back after Kharasom, eagerly pointing out the jungle-covered hills where the Japanese had been gathering. The memorial stone that sits in the middle of the village is a theatre honour for the Assam Regiment, antecedents of the Assam Rifles. It was inaugurated in March 2010 by Major General Singh, Assam Rifles. While we were being shown around the village, a wreath-laying ceremony at the memorial stone was being organised for us to film, which was extremely moving to see a current member of the Assam Rifles lay a wreath of flowers freshly picked. The memorial stands in the grounds of what had been the camp of the Assam Regiment in 1944 and is now the barracks for the Assam Rifles. Jock Young's name is on the memorial stone on the right-hand side, along with the mysterious MC, which had never been awarded. On his headstone in the war cemetery in Kohima, where Jock lies buried, the inscription is the opening words of the 121st Psalm. I to the hills will lift mine eyes, from whence doth come mine aid. Well, I think that concludes our event this evening, and it leaves me just to thank everybody enormously for watching, and thank Roy and Rob for that wonderful presentation, which I hope you've all found extremely interesting. We're delighted that Jock Young's family is with us this evening, and we're so pleased to have so many new faces, names join us, as well as lots of old friends and loyal and regular supporters. Rob is normally in charge of answering any questions that you may have, but as he's been busy pushing all the buttons this evening, if there are any further or outstanding questions, we'll pick them up afterwards. I want to give Rob a plug because he's put a lot of work in tonight, and most of you will know what an eminent historian he is and an author of many books. And his Burma campaign selection are all available on our website, along with the film, the DVD that I mentioned that we were making. And of course, all sales of those items, the proceeds go towards our work in Nagaland. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you all. You're all such wonderful supporters, and many of you have become friends, and to thank you for attending this evening. We're putting together a programme of these events for throughout the autumn, and we look forward very much to welcoming you to the next one. Thank you so much. Good night.